Yeah, hi folks. Now folks, I still have reservations about Liz Gunn that I simply cannot shake. Now 5 years ago, she gleefully interviewed this far-left, ultra-woke, self-loathing white apologist named Max Harris for 2 hours, divided into 4 parts, and part 2 was about decolonization. Now why would she interview a guy who used to work for Helen Clark at the UN for 2 hours if she didn't believe in the UN and decolonization? But first, never ever ignore your gut feeling. It is usually right. This is the real Liz Gunn. Remember this?
How was the audacity and the bravery of our Maori battalion in World War II that my father revered? Our beautiful Maori.
Yeah, now Cross the Rubicon rightfully called her out on this virtue signalling BS.
The first thing that jumped out at me about Liz's video was the Maori carving around the neck. Greenstone, I believe. It was hard to see because it's underneath mesh. You can see it. It's underneath the mesh she was wearing around the neck. I'm not sure whether she was trying to conceal it or semi-conceal it, but it was obvious to me that she was making a statement without saying any words, because it was 2 fists size around the neck. Now, when someone wears that in New Zealand, especially if they're not Maori, it tells you something about that person. And to me, it spoke volumes. Now, vast majority, I would say, or say a big lump of the community, maybe 60-70%, are sick to death of what's happening in New Zealand and what's really escalated these past few months, even weeks. The Maorification of nearly everything in New Zealand. The Maorification, the name changing of our cities, of our towns, street names, without a mandate. They're just doing it because they can. They've got the tails up and they've got the wind at their back. They know anybody who complains about it is going to be called racist. And yet, Liz Gunn says about 15 minutes into the video, our beautiful Maori people, and how brave the Maori battalion were in the war, and how her own father admired such bravery. Now that to me was incongruous to the video. Why did she feel the need to seek out for special mention Maori? Of course there's beautiful people in Maori, there's beautiful people everywhere, but why did she have to give Maori special mention? In 2 cases, Maori people, beautiful Maori people, and how brave the Maori battalion were. Why did she feel the need to say that? Plus the greenstone carving around the neck. And what she didn't mention, what she failed to mention, was the Maorification of New Zealand. She failed to mention that. A lot of people are concerned about this. Thousands, tens of thousands. No mention of it at all. Hey Pua Pua, no mention. 3 Waters, no mention. Co-governance, which is the big one. The elephant in the room is the Maorification of everything.
Yeah, and lo and behold, 1 week later, Liz Gunn comes out with this. The greenstone carving has gone, and she says this.
We will scrap all race-based policies and instead adopt a position based on need and necessity.
Which will be race-based.
The system of apartheid being built up in this country will be torn down. The push towards co-governance will end.
None of that is true, folks. You simply can't change your position in 1 week and expect people to believe it. Yeah, now folks, these are NZ Loyal's completed policies, and nowhere do they mention co-governance, which is New Zealand's most divisive issue today. But hey, they found time to do one on abortion. Or perhaps they've done that to capture the female vote, I'm not sure. Now let's go to Max Harris and the real Liz Gunn.
In my last 20 years in and out of the media, sometimes being a full-time mother, going back to law a little bit, but mainly in terms of communication, there are some interviews that really excite me. Today's one is one such. The New Zealand Project by Max Harris. I want to just begin by quoting, as an introduction, to the ending of the book. Today, perhaps projecting a little based on my own experience, I think a different kind of heart needs repairing, the heart of our country. This repair is about all of us. We've stumbled and fallen. Our heart's connective tissue has been weakened, and we need the pulse of our social conscience to start beating harder again. So what are we waiting for, he asks. Max Harris, welcome. That ending is so beautiful. And
oh, everything she says is so beautiful. She is so gushy, she makes me cringe.
Many of us are feeling we've lost our way in New Zealand. Take me back to the genesis of this book, how it all began, because there's a heart connection there. August 2014.
That's right. Yeah, so 3 years ago, my personal heart had a bit of a scare when I started having quite severe chest pains in New York, where I was working for Helen Clark in the United Nations.
Oh, and she's so happy about him working for Helen Clark at the United Nations.
Welcome. This is the second part in a series, a small series on the book, The New Zealand Project by Max Harris. A wonderful book. We've already talked about incorporating values into the New Zealand political media landscape, even our justice landscape. This is at the end, this is what Max writes at the end of the first chapter. I haven't lived long enough yet to have lost a sense of hope or a sense of the possible. But I've lived long enough to know that things are moving too slowly for those of us with hope who want to make the impossible possible. And I've lived close enough to death to feel like we have no time to lose. Welcome, Max Harris. We have no time to lose. There's an urgency with the election that's happening in New Zealand. I want to pick up on what we talked about last time, the values that are needed in New Zealand politics. How do we bed those in? Let's talk about the 4 values you picked up on.
So the values of care, community, creativity and love.
Oh, love.
Are going to be interpreted in different ways by different people. But I think we need to have a discussion about what we want to flow from those values. And importantly, I don't think we can take those values forward without having a conversation about decolonization. And the reason I think that's so important, I could say what I mean by that, is decolonization is about the Māori worldview in New Zealand and the relationship between Māori and others. And I think we know that Māori have perspectives on values that have been very long-standing, and we make the most of those perspectives if we commit to decolonization.
And we have not made the most of them because colonization in its myriad forms, it's tied up in the economic, the political, the cultural, the social and the intellectual. Just give us some examples of what colonization has done in some of those fields. Just some grunty examples there.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm not Māori, so I don't have the sort of family stories that have been passed down to many Māori about how people have been really personally affected. But I have spoken to people like Moana Jackson. I've read the work of people like Ani Makaere who've written really beautifully about this. And I mean, there are a number of things we could talk about. I mean, a whole lot of land was confiscated in huge swathes and bought up unfairly, and it was problematic in itself in New Zealand history, especially in the 19th century, because land was important to Māori life and to anyone's lives, but it was particularly problematic because of how important the land is to our Māori in the Māori world. The word for land in Māori whenua also means placenta, and there is an idea of people being intimately connected to the land.
So that's why they raped and pillaged it.
So we have the phrase tangata whenua, people of the land, the idea that people actually kind of belong to the land. So that's one example, the loss of land, which we can't get away from. Then,
I'll just stop you there. That's
yeah.
a deeply significant shift, isn't it?
Yeah.
Instead of the land belonging to the people or the person, the people belong to the land. We are
right.
temporary occupants of this amazing land.
That's right.
Yeah. It's such a sort of sad genesis of the colonists in a way. We came out of industrialized England, and again it ties in with neoliberalism in a way. It was about money and profit and what you could make from the new lands, the new countries. But we met these people who were deeply connected with a love, with an aroha for the land.
And aroha for the land.
Exactly.
The clash of cultures, wasn't it? How do we affect that decolonisation?
How do we affect that decolonisation, she says. So she's clearly right into this, folks.
How do we stop that clash of worldviews now?
So I think, and this is drawing on the work of people like Moana Jackson, we have to break down that word a little bit, because it's a word that maybe is not commonly used in the mainstream media, even if Māori have used it. So what the word means is, drawing on those people's work, is understanding and undoing the negative effects of colonisation.
So within that, there's an acknowledgement.
That's
there's
right,
a deep
that's right.
acknowledgement.
That's maybe the sort of negative side, and then the positive side is recentering the views of Indigenous peoples, in our case Māori, and then extending that to different parts of our society. So we have to understand, how colonisation has affected us and has seeped into the present, and that takes us to land, that takes us to language, and te reo Māori, and how te reo Māori was not just neglected but also suppressed.
Oh, suppressed. Yes, suppressed by Maori elders themselves, as they saw English as the way forward.
As ways of achieving decolonisation have been changing how we think about education, so that we centre Māori stories and history properly in our education system, teaching the language, the Māori language, te reo Māori in schools, and going beyond that, ensuring that Māori have leadership in the new politics that we want to build.
Let's take that middle one, the teaching of te reo.
Yeah.
What would that do for all New Zealand children? What are the beautiful benefits that flow from that, Max?
What are the beautiful benefits that flow from that? Referring to te reo, she says.
When you speak te reo Māori as a Pākehā, you say to me that I'm important. And I think that's a sense that lots of Māori people have, and that if Pākehā learned the language, that would be an expression that this culture is important, and it's important to our future.
And that goes right back to bedding in the first of those values,
That's right.
which is care, which is manaakitanga, which has that beautiful concept of I respect you, I look up to you.
That's
so
right.
it's a tangible way to show that respect.
It shows a deep
Oh, she's loving this, folks.
concern for the other. That's right, for another person.
For the cynic who says, that's all very well, that can that actually change the bedrock of a society, that sort of respect? We're talking about decolonisation. The meeting of the cultures suddenly is less of a clash and more of a softening, isn't it? Because there are so many ways decolonisation works. Tell us a little bit more about your inspiration for this whole chapter in the book on decolonisation. Why did you feel this is such a crucial marker for a different kind of New Zealand?
So I think one reason is I grew up in a primary school in Wellington, Clyde Key, which had a real focus on Māoritanga, on Māori stories. So we learned about kupe, we learned about Maui, and we learned about rangi and papatuanuku. And we also had kapahaka, and we sang waiata. And
Tell us the story of your big mouth, Max. It's a sweet story in the book.
So I was asked to be the sort of Pākehā co-leader of the school haka, which was a moment of real pride for me. And I do remember this teacher whaia.
Yeah, she's really enjoying herself here, and that is because this is who she is.
There's more talk about whiteness and privilege and what it means to try to shift a society that has very open wounds. And I think there's something we can learn from that here too.
And a shift away from colonial thinking altogether.
Exactly.
I want, though, to go into something that is on the rise around the globe, especially with Trump in power, and that is this structural racism.
Yeah, now she's parodying Democrat talking points here, propagandised by the mainstream media in America.
And there are many attempts, we've seen it lately with the statues in America. How do we deal with the rise of that, apparent rise of that, Max?
Yeah, I'd like to say apparent rise because I think actually we've had this sort of endemic racism for a long time, and in some ways it's only kind of coming to the surface with Trump, and Trump is only a symptom of a kind of culture beneath that.
Those were peaceful Māori who were invaded by the British Army.
That's right.
And betrayed.
That's
Those wounds go through generations. The healing is partly this korero, but what else is it? What else is, for example, Te Tiriti, the treaty, what is needed there? Because there are Kiwis saying, they've been paid out, it's done, it's dusted, let's just close the book on it. What would you say to that, Max?
Yeah, well, I'd say, in the words of Moana Jackson, treaties aren't settled, they're honoured, and they are covenants, they're promises that were exchanged between two people and intended to have enduring force,
enduring gravy train, you mean?
To have power over time. And if we want to honour that, and I think we do because there are some beautiful things in Te Tiriti o Waitangi, then we need to recommit every generation to making this document a living document in our lives. What does that actually mean? Well, there are some facts that are pretty clear. One is that it was Te Tiriti o Waitangi that was signed, the Māori version of the treaty, and that version should be the version that we all recognise as the key version of the treaty.
Yeah, and he's correct there.
And actually it's not that complicated, so that gave power of government, although there is some debate around translating, but essentially gave power of government to the Crown, and it gave power of chieftainship, absolute chieftainship over taonga and treasures to Māori, and at the same time assured Māori equality. And I think actually there are seeds of really important ways of living in that document.
Give me an example of a beautiful seed.
Well,
Give me an example of a beautiful seed.
I think just the idea of good government comes out of that Article 1, the idea of sharing power.
No, there's nothing in the treaty about sharing power.
I lived in Australia for 10 years where the voice of Aboriginals is so silenced, and again a very rich Indigenous culture that could have offered so much. I never heard one white Australian use one Aboriginal word until I became so homesick for this country. And it gave me this wonderful gratitude that we have a Māori people who are so strong that they would continue, as you say, over years and years to stand for their principles. We're very blessed to have that, aren't we? A people who would stand up to the incoming populace.
Yes, and of course, I mean, as you know, the story of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders is also a really impressive story of survival, and there have been great efforts there too. But what we do have in New Zealand, I suppose, is a slightly more mainstreamed appreciation of Māori culture, even though there's such a long way to go. Some things like the haka, I think, and the fact that the New Zealand national anthem is now spoken in Māori have helped to inch forward the kind of appreciation of another worldview. But there is so much still to go, so much of a way still to go.
You make a good point in your book that can sometimes become a bit like just a pretty little mascot. We say beautiful Māori phrases, but then do we really feel that? We do the haka, are we really connecting with what that is?
Exactly, and it's...
How do we deepen that? I mean, te reo is one way to deepen it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean...
Yes, she's as woke as they come, folks. Anyway, folks, I'll leave it there today, and I've posted all the relevant links below.